This is the Overton Pod. Hello, Kanthan.
And how's it, John?
Yeah, I'm doing all right.
How's the world of journalism treating you?
Tough. A lot of drinking and depression, mainly, and then just writing nonsense stories. No, I kid. I joke. That was a joke. See, Kanthan, I got a laugh out of Kanthan. It's an interesting space, and I'm still learning to navigate it. So, but let's not get too stuck on that. That's maybe conversation for another time. There's lots to talk about. Lots.
Where are we starting this week? I think we kind of went all over the place last week, and we didn't really get a chance to segue into some of the more interesting things that were derived from where the conversation started, which you might remember was based on the incompetence of politicians and where we went from there.
And the unprincipled nature of them. Can we talk about how this boat crashed ship? You're not meant to call it a boat. A ship, a container ship in the Baltimore harbor. Leaving the Baltimore harbor late at night, about 1 a.m. their time, and it crashed into, it lost power. Turns out you need power to run all motor vehicles or motorized vehicles of any sort. And it lost power, and it then was unable to properly steer. This is the official story, of course. I'm sure I have people shouting at the screen right now, no, that's not what happened. But the official story is it lost power, it was unable to steer properly, and it ended up colliding with the main support, one of the main supports of a bridge in Baltimore, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, I think, if I'm not mistaken. You'll correct me on that. I might be slightly off. I'm going off the top of my head.
That Joe Biden remembered taking that bridge? He used to drive over it with a train.
I do know that. It's very fascinating because it was a 4-lane road-going bridge.
Absolutely.
And it had no train tracks on it and has never had a train track on it. It's also interesting.
People don't appreciate the greatest gift that Nelson Mandela gave us, guys. And I just want to digress for a second.
Okay, digress.
The greatest gift that Nelson Mandela gave us is that he stepped down at the end of his first term because he realized that he was getting to that certain age where his mind was going to be growing. And he did the world an entire favor. And consider that Biden is pretty much exactly at the same position that Mandela was. And instead of doing the honorable thing...
That is an insult to Mandela, to even people who don't like him. I mean, I think that's true about
who doesn't like Mandela besides the EFF?
They don't like him today, right? It's a current thing kind of thing, because they don't like Zuma when they don't like him, and they do like him when they do like him. And when there's a resurrection narrative around Mandela, which will happen the minute we have economic growth, then they'll like him again. So it's really just a popularity thing. Look, I think there are people, and I suppose this also actually talks to what I want to chat about today, which is there are people who, they feel the Mandela is not spoken about in holistic terms. Let's be charitable. So, the likes of people who want him spoken about, well, he was a terrorist. He went to jail for a reason. Those types of people. This is the kind of stuff you'll see online. Before the online space, you would have seen it sort of, in sort of corners of the sort of written world or spoken about quietly in certain groups, I guess. And people who argue that there's an official narrative and that this he has an official narrative around him, which is not true.
The same is true for every prominent person.
Absolutely.
There's an official narrative. And I guess the thing right now is that most people who end up in any way saying anything about Mandela actually don't have a clue in terms of what he was, where he came from, and what he actually ended up believing in. And the truth of the matter is that for most of his administration, it was Thabo who was running the government, and Mandela was really just the kissing babies and shaking hands kind of person to a large extent.
Yes, and he was a statesman, and I think he does fulfill that title as a
Yes,
statesman.
absolutely.
I personally think he fulfilled that role quite well. I do look at it holistically. But I find the people who want to look at it, from that holistic side, they say, and want to make a negative claim around the man, seem to forget that he took power of an entire country and its military. Had been in prison for 27 years, so had good reason for seeking vengeance and retribution. And in my opinion, never really did that. And let's be very clear here. In other places where people have risen to the same level
Although
of
at the
power,
same time, let's take the very specific view that the ability to do that was constrained at the time by the government of national unity and what came out of Codesa. And
perhaps. I think yes, to a point.
And also at the time, the overwhelming majority of the competent people in the newly merged South African National Defence Force happened to be Boers who were very skilled at using the weaponry they had at their disposal. Remember, at the time, we were rated by Jane's Defence Weekly as the 6th most powerful military in the world.
There's no hint, though, that he ever even thought about or tried or considered.
But pragmatically, it would have been impossible. I mean, consider that when Mugabe took over Zimbabwe in 1980 and he retained Peter Wall as commander-in-chief of the joint Zimbabwe Defence Force, because it's a pragmatic thing to do. And I think pragmatism is hugely underrated,
pragmatism is not liked.
Yes.
Donald Trump is hugely pragmatic.
Yes, and one
and
needs
is
to
very
take
unpopular
a view
for
around
it.
that type of stuff. That don't get into fights that you're not likely to win. The fascinating thing, I go to the bush quite often, and you watch Nyalas, Nyala males, because there's very distinct sexual dimorphism in the case of Nyalas.
You're
Unlike
telling me they know what a woman is.
I'm saying that they look
Or a
entirely.
female,
They
at
look
least.
like an entirely different species. The women and
The females of the Nyala.
and males of Nyala. But the point is that if you ever take a look at Nyala horns, they are flippin' lethal. They are like stilettos. And so when the Nyalas are going through their territorial disputes, which the males do, because that's what happens in the world, that males compete for the right to have access to the females.
Yep.
And there's a very intricate dance that takes place between the Nyalas because they don't actually clash horns. And eventually one of them decides, okay, I've had enough and I'm leaving, and okay, you can have the females in here. But it's pragmatism, because if they actually happen to have a real encounter, the chances are that both of them are going to end up dead. Because it doesn't really matter if you end up winning that particular battle, but you have had your sides slit by the stilettos of your opponent's horns, and you're both going to end up dying. So pragmatism is actually deeply rooted in the survival of of all species, except human beings.
Look,
But of course,
I think
by that token, I must also point out that we're the only species that commit suicide.
Are we the only species that does that?
Yes.
Lemmings don't count?
No.
Why?
Because have you actually seen those lemmings? Do they think that they're suicidal? No, they're going to the water. It's not a deliberate,
It's not a deliberate
plan.
attempt to die.
Exactly.
I got you.
So, but we started off with this ship.
Yes, we did.
and-
So I just, on the pragmatism, I'm just going to point out that, as you say, some humans aren't particularly pragmatic, and we did get very derailed on Mandela there. But he could have chosen not to be pragmatic, and it could have caused a lot of problems. And we did have a relatively successful country, and certainly were well when he left and chose to leave after a short term, as Joe Biden should have done about 10 years ago in the Senate. But and now my train of thought, my train is not on the bridge. No, but he Joe Biden should have left. Mandela did leave, set the country up quite well. And I mean, you say Thabo Mbeki was running it from the beginning regardless. But we did relatively okay for some period of time.
Well, that's where the pragmatism kicked in, because remember that when the ANC came in, we had this grandiose idea of the Reconstruction and Development Program.
Yes, gear.
No.
Before GEAR.
No, before GEAR, there was the RDP. And Jay Naidu was the minister of the RDP because he came from the background of being Secretary General of COSATU back in the day. And the idea was that there was going to be this grandiose socialist experiment that was going to take place under the RDP ministry. And up steps Thabo Mbeki, and he says, no, we're actually changing this stuff around. We are not going for reconstruction and development. We are going for growth, employment, and redistribution. But the focus was on growth, on economic growth. And that ushered in the single biggest period of economic prosperity.
And ultimately spelled the end of his time and Trevor Manuel's time, because it was deeply unpopular inside the circles of the ANC, which are communist and socialist. Rob Davies and the likes. All right, let's get back to the ship though, because the ANC is boring.
Ship happens.
Ship happens. Thanks. There's a dad joke for everyone. Kanthan's on your screen because I can't take credit for that. This ship crashes into this main support beam of this particularly long bridge, which is quite an important tributary for the city of Baltimore, and also is directly over the main waterway into the harbour. The bridge then collapses. Fortunately, it was very late at night, and apparently the ship captain I read today sent kind of a mayday call saying that they'd lost control, and for a few minutes before that, and police had actually kind of gotten into action and blocked the bridge off on either side. So there were minimal vehicles on the bridge at the time that it went down, and at the moment it looks like 6 people may have died, construction workers that were on the bridge. Now, to me, I looked at that and I looked at it and went, okay, I mean, it's an accident. The ship steered into the bridge. It shouldn't have. It shouldn't happen.
The interesting thing is that in terms of the way in which all U.S. ports work, you have to have an American pilot who's actually steering the ship in and out of the American harbor.
So you're telling me the Italian captain was not responsible?
It was very clear that the rules of engagement are that you have to have an American pilot who's actually responsible for steering in and out of the harbor.
Right. So my issue is this. To me, this looks like an accident. But instantly, and I mean instantly, within 30 minutes of the video going live, and it went live instantaneously because there's a permanent feed that has that bridge in sight. And within 30 minutes of that happening, the conspiracy theories were there. It's a cyber attack. It was purposefully done to harm American infrastructure or to paralyze this port, and that would paralyze the East Coast and their shipping and all of this kind of stuff. And I just looked at this and I thought to myself, okay, I'm not saying conspiracies don't happen. We just went through a phase where there was a lot of stuff that happened which the authorities told us either wasn't happening or they just lied to us directly. And so I get that. I get that some things are not as they seem. But I'm really getting quite tired of this. Everything is a conspiracy. Absolutely everything. And there's nothing you can do to overcome it. So, with the ship, they'll release all the data and information, and people will still say, no, this was some sort of PSYOP or CIA plan or Mossad. Of course, we'll get into that a little bit later, but ultimately it all comes down to the Jews, of course. But, there's that. The week before, we had Princess Catherine not appearing anywhere. Stupidly, the PR people that manage her stuff released a photoshopped image to try and allay everyone's concerns instead of just coming out and telling the truth. Then she does come out, filmed on video, saying, "Look, I've got cancer," or the wording of it was terrible, by the way, just in my very rudimentary medical knowledge. They took out an organ and they found cells of cancer in the organ. I mean, okay. And now they're giving me chemo. Okay. I mean, you should chat about that. But anyway, but she comes out on video and says all of this stuff. And then instantly there are people going, well, that shirt she's wearing, that shirt, we recognize a stripy shirt from 7 years ago. She also wore a stripy shirt and they look very similar, same shirt. And which princess really recycles their shirts? I mean, she's a princess after all. She must have new clothes every day from Dior and Gucci, etc.
But people who say stuff like that just don't fundamentally understand the nature of rich people in England.
No.
Because they have absolutely the most shabby clothes that they recycle for years on end. It's covered with dog hair and generally smells of horses.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
look, my point is this.
But let's
everything that happens. Oh, and we had Russia being attacked, a terrorist attack in which 150 people were killed. And as the same, even as it was still happening, people turning around and going, "Oh no, this is the Israelis and this is the CIA and this is
the fascinating
Ukraine."
thing is that the Americans immediately said, "No, it's not Ukraine, it's ISIS." And the Russians turned around and said, "Hang on a second, who said it was Ukraine?"
Yeah, look,
and you guys are able to say with certainty this was not Ukraine when you haven't worked out who bombed Nord Stream 2 yet. And by the way,
okay, so this gets into the meat of the conversation.
So the meat of the conversation goes back to the question of the bridge. So we've already established that yes, there were U.S. pilots that were on board. Now our fellow South African Lara Logan, who happens to be a fairly controversial commentator on things,
just a bit,
yes, but. Released a fairly long thread shortly thereafter. It said multiple intel sources say that the Baltimore Bridge collapse was an absolutely brilliant strategic attack on U.S. critical infrastructure, most likely cyber.
So, but you see, this is my problem. Mm-hmm. Multiple sources, Kanthan, and I've heard multiple sources before from people who've been lying. Multiple sources said that, in fact, 51 former CIA heads and not heads, but
said
people
that
who
Joe
worked
Biden,
there, said that the Hunter Biden's laptop was fake 2 weeks before the election, when it showed in polling that if that had come out that the laptop was correct and accurate, it would have swung the election. So, I don't, sorry, I don't, you'll take a little bit, and this is really the meat. It's not about the ship. The ship is just something that's happened recently that I can use to show the example. So is the Princess Catherine thing. So is the Moscow terrorist attack. We can go back to October 7th, where there's still basically, amongst people who do not like Israel, there is significant belief that was not a Hamas attack. Okay, they believe degrees of things about it, but bottom line is that ultimately Hamas was not responsible.
So, but let's go back to the ship very specifically, and part of the problem that we've got today in terms of how these conversations play out is that we try and put things into a particular category, which people tend to do when there happens to be a series of narratives unfolding at the same time, and people try and find ways to see whether they are potentially interlinked or not. And I think that there's a danger in that when you try and say there's something in common with the narrative around Kate Middleton, there's something in common with the narrative around Israel, there's something in common with the narrative around the terrorist attack in Moscow, and there's something in common with what just happened with the ship hitting the bridge. Now, if we look at it from the perspective of could this potentially have been a cyber attack? Now, here's what leads to this being a potential source of credibility. The fact is that turning off the engines of a ship, which is basically what happened in this particular case, is not something that just sort of spontaneously happens, because it's not like a scenario where you happen to be flying a single engine Cessna and the engine suddenly cuts out because, it just so happens that there's only a single engine on there. If you have a scenario where you are flying your regular jet aircraft, which have two engines, you can safely land with one engine.
You can, but
So now let's go back to the ship.
But aircraft engines, both of them, have turned off before in flight as a result of power failure.
As a result of power failure, exactly. And so now we're getting back to the
And there was no conspiracy.
So we're getting back to the crux of this particular matter right now. In order for this particular accident to have taken place, it was necessary for the engines to fail at precisely the spot.
Sure, but that's how accidents happen.
Right.
That's how accidents happen. It's necessary for you to swerve at precisely the right
Now,
position.
ask yourself in terms of
to have a car accident.
Now, in terms of the electronics that go onto running a ship,
Yes.
do you think that it's actually possible to just simply turn off the engines on a ship?
I do. So here's the other side of this coin, which is I do not know enough to make that deliberation, right? If I was told by people who seem to be credibly knowledgeable enough on this particular matter to tell me that, yes, it's possible, this is how engines might go out. What I know from aircraft is that it's certainly possible. If ships work in any of the same way as aircraft, then it is absolutely possible. It's unlikely, but certainly not impossible, and it doesn't require malintent. It's something that can happen. Okay, now I don't know if that's true for ships, but I would have to find out. And this is the other problem, is people who don't know, who want to assume everything is a conspiracy. And the meat for me is this. Some things are just true. Some things do happen. There doesn't have to be a different story. If the people you disagree with, like the government, for example, or the intelligence agencies, or your worst enemy, happen to say that the sky is blue, you don't have to fundamentally disagree with them just because, they can't be trusted. Yes, I agree. The CIA is not a trustworthy organization. I agree that the American government is probably not overall a trustworthy organization. I agree that they do things all the time, that they lie about. But I also think that some things are evidently true, and you don't have to
You
chase
seem to be
everything.
quite emotionally vested in this particular incident, John. Now, from my perspective,
No, I don't care whether the ship was. I mean, I think you're retarded if you think the ship was not an accident. And I'll tell you why. Because the conspiracy there. Listen, if you want to go down cyber attacks, there's a number of ways there's a number of cyber attacks you can do. I mean, you could cyber attack the entire air traffic control infrastructure and fly 4,000 aircraft simultaneously into mountains and the ground. Okay, you could do something hectic like that. You could cyber attack an entire city and shut down its electrical infrastructure, which would kill hundreds or thousands of people almost instantaneously through traffic accidents, power failures at hospitals, etc. All right, there are a lot of cyber attack things you could do. The idea that you would cyber attack a random ship without knowing fully, remember, there's a lot of other stuff going on here. There's currents and there's wind. All right, you don't have control of the currents and the wind, except for the Jews who control the weather, of course. That's a joke, but some people believe it. You don't control the currents, you don't control the wind, and so you're gonna shut off this ship's engines, and it's going to end up hitting this thing just right so that the whole bridge collapses, which doesn't really matter. And that's the big point. It doesn't really matter. Why?
so to quote from the
right.
purported source, they chose a full moon so that they would have maximum tidal shift, rise and fall, brisk flow in that river on a normal day, and have a lot of rain recently, so water was already moving along at a good pace.
Is that the conspiracy?
Yes, it is the conspiracy.
That they chose that time because they've got lots of water and tidal shift.
So Logan is quoting what she says are multiple intel sources. Take it for what it's worth.
Yeah.
Okay. And all I'm saying to you is that when you have a scenario where you have a journalist who has a track record of actually bringing forth sources that have been proven to be consistently correct in the past, and is now reporting that those sources,
Logan's been wrong as well in the past.
as has Seymour Hersh for that matter. But by
Yes.
and large, the idea is that when you have a track record on the part of a particular journalist of being right most of the time, which I think is true for for most journalists.
but what the information she's giving sounds like what she has is some people who are involved in intelligence. Now, involved in intelligence can mean anything, all right? That could mean,
as I said, you seem to be particularly emotionally invested in this particular thing.
no,
Can
I'm invested in the idea. This is such a silly idea to latch onto as a conspiracy that I am astonished at the number of people who cannot stop themselves for 1 second of looking at every instance or occurrence in the world and seeing it as a conspiracy. I think that there is a problem with this going on.
So can we agree
globally.
between us
Yes.
that this was an accident?
So personally, unless I see further evidence,
All right. Because look, from my perspective, it looks like an accident. But the fact is that you have a journalist who has a track record of credible sources, who has put forward
Okay.
a particular theory, and we need to watch this. I don't have enough information
you also have
on what actually
you
went
also
down.
have other journalists,
But also,
who have track records who say the opposite, and who also have intel sources. So
I haven't seen those
saw,
intel sources.
I saw multiple commentaries from people with these skills specifically, from naval intelligence and from the Navy, talking about this happening and saying this could happen, that it wouldn't need to be a specific incident. However, again, it's not about, I'm using this as an example because I think this is one of the dumbest sort of chasing the cars that we've had recently. There is a lot of stuff going on in the world which I absolutely buy is labeled as a conspiracy theory, and I don't think is a conspiracy theory. I think it is factual. I think there is evidence there. You can see who's lying and who's part of the sort of the trickery, and that's fine. But it's become this problem that people now instinctively don't trust anything, even their own eyes. And so they will look at any event that occurs in the world outside of their own. And this is an important part. They will look at any event in the world outside of their own, and they will attribute that event to being not real, or that the story of that event is completely different to the general story that is
So
known.
you're saying October 7th didn't happen?
I'm not saying that at all. I'm
But
saying
you may apply the same logic there.
I'm saying no. So Kanthan, I am saying that you need to look at every single event, and you need to let's go to COVID, because this is the big elephant in the room, right? There was a lot of stuff in COVID that was obviously lied about. Lockdowns are good. If you keep kids out of school, you're going to save granny and you won't harm your kids. Masks work. There were lots of things said which were either half-truths or complete lies. All right? They were said by people in power and authority, many of whom are still in power and authority. However, what's happened subsequently to that whole dissident movement is that you now have, because some people can't stop at anything can be the truth. So people who said, no, I don't like lockdowns and I think they're a bad idea. And no, I actually don't think we should close schools. And no, I don't think social distancing makes any sense. And no, those stupid screens at the tellers is also pointless, are also pointless. And, you know, all those types of people. Now you have a fight in that group of people between people who actually believe there was a virus that made people sick, people who believe there was a virus but it didn't make people sick, and people who don't believe in viruses. Okay? right? That is how the conspiratorial hole that movement has moved down, right? And I'm just pointing out that there is a problem when you cannot stop swallowing every single possible conspiracy theory or anti sort of truth. And it's not necessarily an anti-truth. It's just whatever the sold narrative is. So whatever the narrative is, you go against it. Doesn't matter what it is. I'm saying there have to be some things you accept because of the facts on the ground are the truth. Any conspiracy that you want to buy into, something that you don't feel is true, has to be driven by data that exists, that you feel proves your position against the mainstream position. And
I
all
don't know
I'm
what
seeing
the mainstream position is in this particular case.
on the ship,
Yes.
the mainstream position on the ship is that it was an accident.
All right. So let's run with that.
Okay.
I'm curious as to why there's this really intense.
Because it's not about the ship, as I've said. It's about the fact that I spend a fair amount of time online.
And I want to go back to my starting point, which is that there's this tendency to try and lump everything into the category of, look, everything is going to spark a conspiracy theory. Absolutely everything.
Yes, but that doesn't stop me from calling you an idiot for believing everything is a conspiracy theory.
The question for me is to what extent we should actually focus on analyzing these things when they come out against the backdrop of the fact that in this particular case, the only impact it's likely to have upon you and me is if we happen to be buying things from Amazon, and it just so happens that the result of this has been that a significant chunk of the Amazon warehouses have now been cut off from access to shipping, and that's going to be a problem. So,
which is why, I don't want to get back into it. My point is very simple. So, and maybe I'll bring it to this podcast, right? Right now, there's no conspiracy theory around this podcast. Doesn't exist. I invite anyone in the YouTube comments to make one. Okay, but right now, as I'm saying this, there is no conspiracy theory. There's no idea that we're being paid by the Russians, as was a conspiracy theory about the Renegade Report. There's no idea that we're funded by the Rothschilds or something, and ultimately we're pushing Jewish ideas into the world. There's no idea that we're actually controlled opposition.
Well, I can prove that I'm not Jewish.
Oh, no, you don't have to be Jewish to no, you're falling down that. You see, you're misunderstanding the conspiracy theorists, Kanthan. The point is, there's no conspiracy that we're controlled opposition. There's no conspiracy around this podcast. It's just a podcast, two guys talking, right? Add 1 million viewers / listeners, and I guarantee you that we will have a lot of conspiracy theories about who and what your and my motivations are, who we're being paid for, what our real intent is, etc. Okay? That's fine. People can have their own ideas about things. People can believe whatever they want. I'm saying, as a person operating in the world, you are operating at a lower functional level if everything that occurs on the planet, in the world, you believe to be a conspiracy. Absolutely everything, and you will not take anything at face value, or even once digging deeper and finding those facts line up with the face value, you still refuse to take those. I think you become mentally deficient, and I see this a hell of a lot. I've seen it happen to people I know who now cannot interact with anything, historical events. They don't believe any historical event is true. The narrative of World War I and II are completely false, they believe. Major events from the past are all untrue. The moon landing, the Titanic, the French Revolution, you name it. Nothing is as
we are not
it's
talking
recorded.
about anything new at this point, because this has been the propensity of our species stretching back over the millennia. It just so happens that they get amplified now based on the fact that we have the technology available to do so. But there are always going to be those conspiracy theorists. There are still those who believe that the earth is flat.
Yes.
And
Good on them.
And that's been going back for years. I think that we probably shouldn't be spending too much time going down this particular rabbit hole, because the fact of the matter is that the most crucial problem that we have right now is that once people adopt a particular viewpoint, they're not able to actually revise that viewpoint faced with new information. And I'll use myself as a very specific example. Go back to the very start of COVID. And at that point, I more or less unquestioningly accepted a lot of the narrative that was going down at the time, because I didn't think through the ramifications of lockdown and all of those things at the point at which they said we're going to do this and we're going to flatten the curve and all of that kind of stuff. And it was only at the point at which this actually happened that I then started revisiting all of the initial ideas that I just simply accepted. And at that point, instead of doing what a lot of people were doing, which was to say, no, if you are not masking, you are literally killing us, and all of that type of stuff, I was at that point stepping back and actually revisiting what we knew about it. It's a virus. Why are we washing our hands? Because that's not the way in which it's transmitted. Why are all of these contracts being awarded for sanitizer? So that is an entirely different scenario. Now, what we have right here, and to go back to the Baltimore Bridge, I accept it as an accident up front. I still accept it as an accident. But what I am saying is that there is now a trail emerging, much like the situation around Nord Stream 2, which, remember, we still don't have any credible investigation that has actually pointed to what happened there. And we have sources that actually then turn around and tell us, well, this was actually a covert operation that was carried out by these particular players. No official denial of that in terms of the establishment. Does that mean that the CIA blew up Nord Stream? I don't know the answer. But I'm also saying that I'm not writing it off. This doesn't mean that I'm going to end up obsessing. And I think there's that fine line between being generically mistrustful of everything that comes your way and maintaining a healthy skepticism. I like that old Bedouin saying, trust in Allah, but tie your camel. It's a good one.
Yes, fine. And I don't have any problem with that. And I am a skeptic myself, which is the reason why I could spot the entire issue with a lot of the policy around the pandemic. But I just saying that I find this entire constant need to find conspiratorial events in everything, except, and this is the interesting thing, the most arch conspiracy theorists who believe that, whatever they believe, but they believe pretty much every major event is not as you see it. Okay. I suppose Alex Jones would be the sort of moniker for this type of person. And they've got lots of reasons and information, as you say. They feel they've reassessed the information and they've come to the right conclusion. You haven't. You haven't looked at the data. You haven't studied it. I've heard this said by some of these people is, it's just, you haven't actually sat down and done the work. If you had done the work, they sound like the left, but it's hilarious. But anyway, if you had done the work, then you would know. They never bring this into their personal lives. It's amazing to me. So the entire world is a conspiracy theory. Everything that happens is a conspiracy. Everything you see is a conspiracy. Even the daily news is not just the news. Some random journalist is not just a journalist. They're all being directed. It's all the globalists and whatever. And again, aspects of a lot of these things are true. For example, there are people who call themselves globalists and want the world to be a more globalist society. That's what the World Economic Forum says about its mission. But they never think that their wife is a CIA plant. Never. Okay. They never think that, you never hear about Alex Jones having a bumper bashing.
Love reading The Three Body Problem if you ever get down to it.
I've never heard about Alex Jones's bumper bashing that was actually set up by the CIA. It was just because he accepted that it was a bumper bashing. He wasn't paying attention and he drove into someone, or someone wasn't paying attention. They drove into him. And so it's just fascinating to me the kind of thinking that requires to see everything external as false, and not able to be taken on face value. But everything that occurs to you personally is true and able to be taken on face value. And I think that there's a disconnect in thinking there. And that's basically my bottom line point on this. I really think if you're listening to this or watching this and you are going down this road where you're starting to believe that nothing is true, just tread with caution. That's all I'm saying. Because I don't think it's a path filled with as much critical thinking as you would have been told it is.
So I will continue to trust the Daily Maverick as I do. All right. So.
Yeah. Did you want to move on?
I think we should move on. Yes,
Okay.
very much so.
Yeah, there was a long time on conspiracy. Go for it.
Right. So one of the things that I wanted to touch on last time round was, and so let me just back up a bit, okay? So we now know that Japan has been in a consistent state of negative population growth
Yes.
for a while.
Yes, and they have an upside-down pyramid. For those who might not know what that means, basically, your pyramid of population should look like a normal pyramid. Young people at the bottom, babies, then youth, then sort of young adolescents, and so on. And then the smallest bit at the top of the pyramid should ultimately be old people. But they actually have more old people than they have young people, and so the pyramid is inverted.
Right. And so now there's many theories in terms of why this is happening. And so there's a particular conspiracy theory, okay, which goes back to the World Economic Forum. Mm-hmm. And this conspiracy theory says that there's this general push towards depopulation. You've probably heard this theory, and people speak about it. That
it's not entirely a conspiracy in the sense that Paul Ehrlich. People need to go read Paul Ehrlich. Paul Ehrlich believes in depopulation.
And there's a significant number of people who actually believe that.
And just so I can,
the antinatalists.
I need to say this: Paul Ehrlich was Greta Thunberg of the 70s. He was appearing at the UN. His books were taken as gospel. We were going to have a major.
Did they steal his childhood?
He wasn't clever enough to say that at the time. But, so again, it's not, are there people pulling the strings in Japan to depopulate Japan? No. Are there people who would like to see less people on the earth?
All right.
Absolutely.
So let's just park the depopulation conspiracy theory aside, because that's not what I want to actually.
Yeah. Yes, because we're trying to move away from the conspiracy.
Yes, we're trying to move away from the conspiracy theory. See, the interesting premise around why you actually have a declining birth rate is that Japan lost a war. Yes, Japan lost a war 70 years ago. But, you need to recognize that what happens in wars is that the people who go to the front lines and end up fighting happen to be the alpha males of that society, right? Because clearly, you fail your physical, you're not going to the army. It's as simple as that.
At least back in the day. Now I might be a little bit different.
Yeah, but we're talking very specifically in terms of the context of the way in which things used to happen 70 years ago. So, certainly up until the point at which there was a draft in the United States, you had to be physically fit in order to go to the front lines and fight. So, Bruce Springsteen, for example, famously talks about the fact that when he was called up and took his physical to go to Vietnam and he failed. And so he spoke about this at one of his concerts, and he said, well, it's nothing to applaud about because, there are good people who went to the front line and died. But the crucial thing is that you had in Japan, as was the case in most countries that were taking part in the Second World War, that all of the alpha males went to the front lines. And when you have, in the case of Japan, who lost that war, and a significant body of the alpha males were then wiped out, what you then have going forward into the next generation are all of the beta males and those who are not really interested in the things that alpha males are generally interested in, which is, procreation and spreading the gene pool and all of that kind of stuff. And the result that we are now seeing is a direct impact of what happened in World War II. Now, this is a theory that is not mine. I'm putting this out here because it then got me revisiting what's actually happened in the past in terms of various conflicts where there has been, clearly a winning side and a losing side, and whether or not this is a pattern that we could actually see replicating. And so the reason why I'm raising it now is not because I think that I necessarily want to believe it, but actually what we do have happening in terms of the Ukraine war is a real-life experiment that's going to be happening. And the trick now is to actually put in place all of the data gathering now to see what's going to happen to the population of Ukraine over the next 30-year period. And if this theory is correct, because remember that nearly all of the fit and healthy male population of Ukraine has been sent to the front lines and they've been wiped out.
Yeah.
So this is one of those opportunities where you can say, yes, this is a particular theory, but now we've actually got the benefit to start looking at this very carefully, gathering data over the next 30 years.
Do you think anyone's going to do that?
I think that there's probably a substantial number of people who are going to be doing this because I looked around to see whether there were other people who had come across with these particular theories, and yes, there's a significant body of them who actually believe that is the case.
I mean, it seems self-evident to me. What would be the great achievement in proving it?
I don't think it's a question of a great achievement in proving it. I think it's a question of understanding the way in which, and, to go back to the start of our conversation, where we were talking about the Nyala males facing off. And the crucial point is that I don't think that people are aware of the overall impact of wars on human development. So I think people tend to see them in exactly the same way that we see football matches, that there's a winning side and there's a losing side, and yay, we won, and then we move on from that particular point. And, certainly from my side, I'm very grateful that the Germans did not win World War II. And, here we are today. You
couldn't tell, to be honest. This is my problem.
You're trying to say that.
Happened.
Are you going back down this conspiracy theory rabbit
hole?
No,
I'm just going to point out that Europe is currently run by the Germans. So and they have the technological hub of Europe.
I disagree. It's not run by the Germans. The German economy has been completely screwed over because basically what the Americans did to the Germans is they said, you're not allowed to buy gas from Russia anymore. You have to buy gas from us at 3 times the price.
Yeah.
And all of your industries are now shutting down, but that's okay. We're welcoming your factories into our country. But let's just get back to...
Yeah, we'll get back to your point. Germany has the highest GDP. That you wouldn't... If you told an alien that 80 years ago... there was a country that was completely destroyed.
Germany has been in a state of recession now for the past year.
Yeah, a year doesn't...
No, it is a year because, and again, we'll go back to the definition of recession, which Karine Jean-Pierre does not agree with, which is 2 successive terms of negative economic growth. And Germany has had 4 successive terms of negative economic growth. And let's be very clear, the issue around why Germany is in this current state is that you have an economy that is designed on industry, and the industrial base was as powerful as it was because you had a combination of 2 things. You had very expensive labor on the one hand, but you had very cheap energy. In South Africa, the reason why Mercedes and Volkswagen and BMW are still here is because we have very expensive energy and very cheap labor, and so it actually balances out. But now what's happened as a direct result of the Ukraine conflict is that Germany now has very expensive labor and very expensive energy. And that's why they are deindustrializing at a dizzy rate. I mean, BASF, one of the oldest family-owned businesses, has shut down their operations overwhelmingly in Germany, and they're positioning all of them outside the country. Why? Because they can't afford to run anymore.
Yeah.
They also did the...
I'm not arguing any of this stuff.
Also, the absurd thing that Germany did during Angela Merkel's time was shutting down the nuclear plants. And again, that's a discussion for another day. But if those nuclear plants had been kept running, then once again, that would have been a hedge against the burgeoning costs in terms of energy. And the last point in terms of Germany's deindustrialization is that as a direct result of the Fed keeping the interest rates as high as they are right now, it means that every attempt by the Europeans to raise more money costs them significantly more. Because if you've got the Fed paying interest rates at the high watermark that they are right now, in order for Europe to be more attractive, they have to price it significantly higher in terms of the cost of issuing those bonds, in terms of their interest rates, and they can't afford to do so. So, but
we got very off track there. I'm still gonna. I mean, you brought up my point stands. Germany did far better. Now, if you explain to an alien that Germany was the top country in Europe in 2024, despite their recession, which they will recover from, after what happened in World War II and World War I, for that matter, they would not believe you. And as for BASF, they manufactured Zyklon B. They shouldn't exist as a company. But that is very much a side point. It is how the world works, unfortunately. What was the sort of finality of the Japan and the Ukraine and the...
No, I'm not saying that there's a finality. What I'm saying is that, going back to the question of our two Nyala males.
Yeah.
If people are more aware of the long-term effect of these particular types of conflicts on the survivability of their cultures, I think that, and if that was actually more deeply ingrained in terms of the way in which people go about engaging with other cultures, the first rule of any conflict should be conflict avoidance. And the second rule is that if you are going to go into conflict, just make damn sure that you win as quickly as possible with a minimal number of losses to your side.
Okay. So is it a lesson on war? Is it that we could learn lessons on how to wage war better?
I'm saying that the first lesson that I'm taking from this is that as far as possible, you try and avoid getting into them. But if you are going to get into them, just make sure that you are not taking your brightest and tossing them to the front lines, which is what has been happening.
But isn't that what's going to happen in a war? War requires strength and intelligence. Those two things, you need them in abundance to win against an opponent.
You see, that's the interesting thing again, because there's conventional wisdom in terms of how wars should be fought. And I think that that's a very Western-centric approach. I spoke about this very crucially in terms of the responses on the part of Russia and Israel separately at the time of October 7th happening. And there's this entire difference between a strategic approach to a war and a tactical approach to a war. And the problem with the tactical approach to a war is that you will go out of your way to specifically eliminate targets. But a strategical approach will be to eliminate the underpinnings of actually what makes those targets possible in the first place. And there was an interesting commentary that I was hearing on the part of a guy named Jacques Baud, who actually talks fairly well in terms of modern military strategy and weaponry and so forth. And he said one of the reasons why people in the Sahel just got so irritated with the French troops that were there is that the French troops did not actually have an overall strategy for solving their problems. They would go out and they would target these Islamist terrorists that were coming in to the territories, but that doesn't solve the problem of, preventing them from actually coming up in the first place. And so the difference in terms of the tactics versus strategy, if I look in terms of Russia and Israel, in terms of the way in which they are doing things, I think that the way in which the Russians went about conducting their campaign against the Ukrainians was to effectively bed down, to fortify their lines, and then to do small but incremental gains upon the Ukrainians, as opposed to the situation that we have in Israel right now, where Netanyahu basically has committed a massive amount of resources to an all-out offensive, but it's a tactical offensive because it is taking out people on the ground that are directly on the front lines, but it's not taking out the head honchos who are sitting comfortably ensconced in Qatar and, continuing to plot. And what that means is that I think that the long-term effectiveness of Israel's strategy versus the long-term effectiveness of Russia's strategy is going to be an interesting case study again. And we've got the opportunity to watch both of them unfold going ahead.
Yeah, we do. Although, back to population growth, No,
the reason why population growth has been very crucial is that the difference between what the Ukrainians have been doing and the Russians have been doing, the Russians have been going out of their way to minimize casualties.
What do you mean by that?
What
Because
I
I think
mean
some
by that
people
is
may
that-
disagree.
What I mean by
Their
that,
own casualties.
Their own casualties, yes.
Okay.
Their own casualties. So Kherson being a case in point. Okay, they took Kherson, the Russians. They suddenly realized, sitting in Kherson, actually, it's going to be really difficult to defend this space. Okay, because you've got high ground surrounding Kherson, and it's very easy for shelling from on the part of the Ukrainians to then take them out. What did the Russians do? They pulled out. They were not interested in saying, no, we've taken this, it's going to look like we've got egg in our face because we can hold it. No, they pulled out. And they pulled out because of the fact that it would have been far too costly to stay there and hold it. And you see this pattern in terms of the engagements that the Russians have been doing over and over again. If they realize that in a particular situation they're going to be taking too many losses, then they back off. The encirclement of Mariupol, they did something very similar. Everyone said that you need to be charging the Ukrainians, and they said no. They sat and they waited for months, and it was a piece-by-piece incursion into the territory before they finally took control of the city. And that's what I'm talking about, the difference. If they're trying to minimize their own casualties, it means that they're aware of the fact that you should not be throwing your resources onto the front lines, as opposed to what has been happening in Ukraine. And, to a large extent, this is because Zelensky is a comedian. He knows nothing about military strategy. Everything for him is about the optics of the war and to be shown to be doing something. And he keeps throwing people into the battlefront, and they keep getting killed.
Where do you think this ends? Because I find that more interesting, to be honest. I think there's an argument to be made that Russia has committed far too many of its young people to the war. It's not like it's lost nobody.
No. But it's very clear that proportionately, there's...
no, the Ukrainians are in for... But look, the Ukrainians went up against a superpower. Let's also be clear about that.
No, but we're talking about... but now we're talking about Russia as a superpower. But remember, at the time, you had Lindsey Graham saying that Russia is a gas station masquerading as a country.
Yeah, okay, but it's Lindsey Graham.
Yeah.
My
point being that, again, these narratives shift, At the time, it was,
Okay, but back to Jane's Defense Weekly.
Yes.
Jane's Defense ranks Russia's military in the top 15, I think, in the world, if not the top 10. I don't remember that list very well, but as far as I recall, it would be in the top 15 at least. Before any of this, and regardless of Lindsey Graham's comments, they're a big military, and Ukraine isn't anywhere near there. And so, if you get
actually, at the time, Ukraine had the second biggest military in all of Europe.
It was Germany first, then.
No,
who would have been
Russia
the
was
biggest military?
first. People forget that Russia's a European country.
Barely.
Yeah. No. So
Euro-Asian, I guess.
So at the start of the conflict, Russia was the biggest military in Europe, followed by Ukraine. They had 700,000 people in their military at the start of the war.
Okay, so you learn something new every day. I would not have guessed that in a quiz. You might.
Well, I wrote about that at the start of the war, where I was doing a comparison in terms of what their respective forces were.
Still, Russia is undoubtedly the more powerful force.
Well, at the time, everyone was led to believe, and again, this was the difference between strategy and tactics. The West believed that if they gave Ukraine access to the best and brightest of the weapons that were being produced in the West, that they would be very effectively able to overcome Russia, who, remember at the time that there was this whole thing about, Russia's using
old weapons and their tanks are getting stuck in the mud.
And they're dismantling washing machines because they don't have access to integrated circuits anymore. And instead, what did the Russians do? Well, they simply fortified lines, took up space behind them, waited for the Ukrainians to come forward, and picked them off one by one.
Okay, so again, where are we going with this? Because I hate to say this about an ongoing conflict, but I find it incredibly boring at this point. It's very clear to me that the Ukrainians have lost. Whether it's irrelevant where you stand on that, whether you like that fact or whether you dislike that fact, it's very clear to me they've lost. It's clear to me that the Russians have won overall. Obviously, there's always, war is not a win or lose, unfortunately, because when you surrender however many, if Russia wins but it lost 200,000 men, for example, that's not a win necessarily. If it depleted most of its reserves in terms of its military supplies.
So Ukraine has lost 13 million people that have left the country.
Okay.
Yeah. So, which is almost half its populace. And it's very likely that they're never going to be coming back. So let's put that aside. But the thing to understand is that the only thing that keeps the conflict going is the fact that the U.S. has continued to pour money into Ukraine. The U.S. has to continue pouring money into Ukraine because the last thing that Joe Biden needs at this point is a defeat in Ukraine ahead of the elections. So ideally what needs to happen on Joe Biden's part is he needs to keep stretching out this conflict until the elections happen.
Well, you could take it that way.
If he's able to go into... So here are the scenarios. If he's able to stretch out the funding until the elections happen, he's able to then tell the story at the point of the elections. Look, we've been keeping Russia from overwhelming Ukraine.
Yeah.
And once the elections are over, if Biden wins, then he turns off the taps.
I think you might be...
If Biden loses,
then
Trump comes into power. Russia then, storms all
over.
Okay,
but hold on. Stop right there. What is Trump's big selling point on Ukraine?
That he's going to stop the war immediately.
That's right.
Yes.
Okay, and it's a big enough selling point that you and I both believe that 50% plus one of America may very well vote for him on that basis, partially. And obviously, there's other things.
Sure.
But I'm going to stop the war in Russia in a day, according to him. In fairness, it's Trump and he's hyperbolic and all that, but he will stop it relatively quickly, okay? That's his selling point. He's going to stop the war. Biden's selling point is, I'm not going to stop the war. Putin is a threat to democracy or whatever crap they say. Not that he not that he is a great guy again, but like honestly, Putin is not threatening democracy in the United States, for example. But his Biden's selling point is, I'm going to continue this and I'm going to get rid of Putin, the bad guy. Okay, so they're opposed beliefs, and it's very likely that whatever the outcome of the American election is, it will be close. Okay, so I think Biden could be quite smart if he were smart. A peace deal before the elections may very well, which somehow they swing it, and they've got the media on their side.
So the only peace deal that's likely to happen is a peace deal that actually gives Putin the territories that Russia has since taken.
Sure. And suddenly, when they do that, if Biden's in charge, listen, let me explain to you.
It's going to be very difficult for Biden to spin that.
No wait, Kanthan. Let me explain to you the media narrative that will work. If Biden does a peace deal with Putin before the election, and that peace deal, and let's make it very clear, this would be the same peace deal with Biden or Trump. Okay, the peace deal goes as follows: you get Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and otherwise you fall back. The bits in between you can kind of have, so that Russia becomes it becomes part of Russia again, essentially. There's maybe a small territory that's like a no man's land or whatever it is, but bottom line, that's the deal. Okay, and war ceases. Okay, if Biden signs that deal, the media will push out that Putin was forced to retreat. I want you to keep this moment in this podcast in mind, because if Biden does this, I guarantee you the narrative will be Putin forced to retreat. They will not focus on the territory that he keeps. We will suddenly be reminded that Donetsk and Luhansk were Russian in the first place, which is what everyone has been saying since the beginning of this, regardless. So suddenly the Washington Post will admit to that. Okay, and be as if it was no great loss to Ukraine. Ukraine never wanted Donetsk and Luhansk, okay? That'll be the narrative. If, however, Trump does the exact same deal with Putin, which is what's likely to happen, then it will be traitor Trump, under the control of Putin, surrenders Ukrainian land in war crime, okay?
So we are 100% in agreement.
Yes.
But the only difference between what you're saying and what I'm saying is Biden will not do that until after the elections.
You think because his base wants to be seen for him to be doing the right thing, and from their perspective, that is an ongoing war with Putin?
I'm saying that right now, the possibility of that being a successful sell ahead of the elections is going to be really difficult to do. After the elections, absolutely.
Because the spending in the United States is incredibly unpopular.
Yeah.
So the foreign spending is ridiculously unpopular, to the point that, to me at least, in my interpretation, it seems as if there is a lot of ill will towards government spending from both sides currently. And a lot of that spending, they just signed another spending deal the other day. And there's all kinds of nonsense in there. But some of it is funding for Ukraine. But a lot of people, citizens on the ground, seem to be particularly disgruntled. And those are not just Republicans. Those seem to be Democrats too. So I find it interesting that you think he won't even try. If I were to guess why he wouldn't try, I would say it's more because this is all very lucrative. I mean, there's nobody who's done better off of this war between Ukraine and Russia than the so-called elites in the United States, who've essentially been laundering the money back to themselves. It's interesting. I would hope that it ends sooner rather than later, as I would hope for all conflicts. But you make your point, which is you've got to either, if you're going to start a fight, then you finish it. So I take that point. Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to get off your chest this week?
No, not at all. But once again, I'm saying that Biden is not going to stop unless he wins the election. When he wins the election, he will stop it.
You think so?
If you,
What's his incentive to stop them?
because
If he doesn't have one now, why does he have one after?
because he's gotten as much money out of the U.S. System as he possibly can for that. And remember that that the majority of the money has not gone directly to Ukraine. It goes into the military-industrial complex, presumably for building up weaponry and all of that kind of stuff.
Well, and making a select few people very, very, very wealthy. Okay, I think that's an interesting hour and a bit of discussion. I could not have predicted that if I tried. A whole bunch on conspiracy and quite a little bit on the sort of effect of war, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah. It will be interesting to see. I don't know that you think you'll be around to see the remains of Ukraine, given what's been done to it?
Look, if we really want to go down this road, I'll just toss this in as a kind of tailpiece.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look in terms of the territories that are overwhelmingly Ukrainian, okay, where the majority of the speakers speak Ukrainian rather than Russian, even though ancestrally they're pretty much the same language. All of those territories, so I'm talking about to the far west, okay, which with Lviv or Lvov, however you want to call it, as its focal point, all of those territories were Polish territories.
Okay.
Up until...
what are you saying?
Ukraine
ends
up
up
until
divided.
World War II. What I'm saying is that at that particular... Now, so there's Polish territory, there's Romanian territory, there's Bulgarian territory. All of them have ancestral claims upon this land. And I'm saying that at the point at which Putin marches upon all of the predominantly Russian-speaking sections of Ukraine, and remember that the majority of Ukrainian territory, not the populous territory, is majority Russian-speaking. So the entire east side, stretching all the way down to Odessa, is majority Russian-speaking. The majority of the Ukrainian populace is over in the western side, and they happen to speak Ukrainian. But let's say Putin manages to take all of those territories. And then you have the Poles, who now very quickly are building up to the extent... have you seen the extent to which the Poles have been militarizing? It's massive.
Very ancillary.
Yeah, so it's massive. But are they poised at the point at which Putin then says, oh, by the way, we're happy to recognize Poland's historic claim to these territories, which were taken from Poland?
You think Putin wants to dissolve the entire country of Ukraine? As in there will be no existing, there's no Yugoslavia anymore.
I think it's... Because remember that Poland ceased to exist not long ago as a direct result of all of the conflicts that happened during the time of Catherine the Great. Poland as a territory just completely vanished. It was absorbed by all of the surrounding countries, and then it got recreated. And consider that there are lots of people, nation states that have never had a physical territory to speak of. The Kurds being a one very specific example. So, yeah, I think that it's very likely that Ukraine, as it currently exists, ends up being significantly absorbed by the European countries over to the west. And maybe you eventually have a very small landlocked territory surrounding Kiev that eventually is going to just simply align itself with the Russians. Because, frankly, they don't have the mineral resources there. They don't have the agricultural resources there. They're basically going to be, once again, the poorest country in Europe.
You're describing, I assume, a scenario that assumes the war continues for quite some time, but the Russians continue on their general trend and the Ukrainians continue on their general trend. Assuming Donald Trump is the president of the United States on January the 20th.
No, I'm actually not
2025.
I'm not making that assumption. You see, what I'm saying is that the war will continue for as long as Biden continues to fund Ukraine.
Yeah.
So, because
Okay, but
because in effect Ukraine has already lost. They
But
can't.
we might have less than a year left then, is what I'm saying.
What I'm also saying is that if Biden is not able to pull a rabbit out of his hat and get more money into Ukraine, then Russia is going to be taking control of the majority of Ukraine way before that election. And more to the point, remember that elections were held in Russia over the past month, and people in Transnistria also voted in the Russian elections. You're familiar with Transnistria? It's this little patch of land that is claimed by Moldova, but has Russian troops on it and has been administered by oligarchs.
It's a very weird place as a concept.
It's a place that got forgotten in the breakup of the Soviet Union. And there you have it. But I think that if the money supply ends up running out, then Russia is pretty much going to walk all over Ukraine. I will tell you one thing, one point at which the Russians will not stop. They need to take Odessa. And the reason why they need to take Odessa is because there are people who were responsible for the massacres that took place in Odessa in the wake of the 2014 coup that the Russians have promised to bring to justice. And you're going to have very public trials that are going to happen around the people that were responsible for those massacres.
Wow. Okay. Let's finish it off with one lighter-hearted topic then, because I'm going to move away from Ukraine. It's an interesting prediction. If I had to add anything, I don't know the region as well as you do, but if I had to add anything, I would say that they will continue to fund the Ukrainians. They'll find a way. They're desperate to do it. Maybe partially because they think what you've just said is likely to occur and they want to prevent it. But also just because, as I say, they're benefiting greatly off it. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's happening secondary to the war, which is, one is certain people are getting very wealthy, but the other is that they're busy retooling the entire American military. And they need this money. This money is outside of the normal military budget, and they're using it to basically give them new gen weapons. So there's a whole bunch of things that are happening, and there's a timeline on that, and I don't think they're done with that timeline. Some people say it's 4 or 5 years of a timeline, so let's hope not. But yeah, I would say if I had to guess that there's a chance of a change in power in the US, although I think the chance is far less than it was in 2016. But if that does happen, that war is over by February 2025. Last thing to talk about is P Diddy, because you brought it up before the show. And I hadn't really necessarily intended to discuss it, but you seemed like you had something on your mind.
No, not necessarily. I think that it's kind of interesting that there's a massive focus right now in terms of what's going on out there. And yes, the conspiracy theories are coming out of the woodwork. I think you and I are largely in agreement that anyone who plays in the rap space generally should be considered to be someone that's not exactly a pillar of society. And you know, am I like?
I think that space has matured over decades now, and so there are plenty of rappers who are just rappers. They're artists, right? They're the same as a pop artist or a rock artist, but certainly the evolution of the rap artist and where P Diddy came from wasn't just, I want to sing, I want to do rap. You know, these were guys involved in their communities, who sometimes weren't involved in the most savory things, and this is why people being sort of drive-by shootinged back in the late 90s, early 2000s was not unheard of. It wasn't surprising. If you had heard that Britney Spears did a drive-by shooting with Christina Aguilera, you'd be very surprised. But you were not surprised when certain rap artists were murdered or when there was violence in that community. So yes, that's sort of, I think is true. But P Diddy is not accused of like this sort of gangster type crime. P Diddy is being accused of Jeffrey Epstein type stuff, which with not other rappers and not sort of that community. He's being sort of lumped in with very wealthy and powerful people, just like Epstein. So I think, again, not enough information at this stage. Difficult to know what is true and what is not because not much has been released. And yeah, we wait to see, in my opinion. I'm not sort of jumping to any kind of conclusions. And, some people think he's a fall guy.
Remember, we are still waiting for the Epstein guest list.
No, well, we're never getting that, Kanthan. I mean, really. Come now. We can never get that. But what I will say is this. It's interesting to me that there does seem to be a general collapse going on in Hollywood. So firstly, Hollywood is a shadow of its former self. If I look at the Academy Awards now, for example, which used to be really the pinnacle of their year, but the pinnacle of the year for many people. Lots of people used to watch that. It used to be a main event. People aspired to be like those people on the red carpet. They were in every sort of advert that you saw or all kinds of promotions. They were big deals. And I just don't see that excitement around Hollywood anymore. Over and above that, you've had the Epstein stuff happen. You've now got this P Diddy stuff coming out. You've had a whole bunch of voices along the way saying negative stuff about the sexual abuse that goes on of women and children. Harvey Weinstein, obviously, and then other incidents. And now there's recently released a documentary on a lot of the stuff that goes on in Hollywood. I think there's a documentary called Quiet on Set, which is all about the sexual child abuse that's happened over the years in these sort of in Nickelodeon and all these kinds of organizations, or allegedly, I should say, because I suppose it hasn't yet been taken to court as far as I know. But it's definitely lost its shine. And it seems as if the number of stories is kind of building into this avalanche. And I don't think it's long before Hollywood, at least in its current shape and form, is probably dead and buried. Now, I'm not saying that industry disappears because it's massive and it's powerful and it's ongoing. And there's a lot of people in that industry who are just doing a good job. Guy that goes onto set to do the lighting or whatever it is, he's just doing a job. So I don't think that all disappears. I just think that there's some sort of, to use terminology I'm not a fan of, but there's some sort of reset that's on its way. And perhaps, maybe, we haven't seen much justice in this regard, but perhaps a reckoning for some people. So we can hope, certainly for people who are guilty. Yeah.
Again, I don't have enough data.
There you go. That's we should label this podcast that we do not have enough data. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much as always. I hope everyone has enjoyed listening to this rather interesting discussion, although very, very winding and varied. And we will see everyone on the next one. Indeed. Thank you.
All right.
Cheers.